So it's a real pleasure to have John on stage here because he has a very unique perspective on what's going on globally in terms of internet trends and technology trends. And DST is a very unusual firm. So in the last 5 years, they've invested $3.5 billion over 15 companies. So that's a little over $200 million in each company, which is not the norm for kind of your traditional Silicon Valley venture firm. And John is based in Hong Kong, but you have a very international pedigree. Would you mind just kind of telling us a little bit about the DST thesis and what you look for and how you invest as a firm?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to tell everyone how pleased I am to sort of see 6,000 people at this place. And I think that we have to hand it to the organizers. And can you please join me in a big applause before we do anything else?
Ow, ow!
So with that done, I just want to thank all of the guys here who've done an amazing job. Going back to your original question, which is, what do we do at DST? As you pointed out, what we try to find are category-leading companies across the globe focused on internet and internet-related technologies. And the reason why we are so focused on this is that we think that we're basically riding a 10 to 20-year trend. We have 2.5 billion people connected online today. We think that this is probably going to grow to 5 billion in the next 5 years. And obviously, like all of you are already experienced, you're going to have the internet in your pocket and on a number of different devices. So we basically try to find investment opportunities and companies that are essentially taking over and leading different categories. And I think specifically, sort of 4 areas that have caught our attention and that has really been our focus for the past few years. One is social media, and obviously we've seen the fantastic success of Facebook and Twitter, both as use case and then in the public market. But then you have companies like Snapchat that basically emerge completely out of nowhere, with a product that just wouldn't have been able to exist if it hadn't been launched on a smartphone. So we think that there are many opportunities out there in social media today and going forward. Then I think that e-commerce is a huge trend that we're focused on. Thirdly, we look at various businesses that can come in and disrupt different verticals. As was announced yesterday, we've just invested in Lending Club, which is a peer-to-peer lender in the US. Again, a company which basically comes in and disrupts the business of established banks. So there are a number of interesting areas.
Right. So you just named 4 different areas that you're interested in. If you were an entrepreneur starting out today, and let's say you had to choose one, so just kind of reverse engineering your thesis a little bit, where would you look? What regions would you be looking at, and what verticals would you be looking at?
That's a very interesting question, and if I had the perfect answer, I would probably go out and start my own business. But I think that the holy grail is pretty close to us in a certain respect. And if you think about in a way that think about the capitalists for the past 200 years. There's been the idea that if you can sell a matchbox to every single Chinese, you will be a rich man. And I think that that's precisely the environment that some companies can harness today. You have 2.5 billion people online. You have 7 billion mobile phone connections. Through iOS, through Android, you have companies like Supercell, like Rovio, basically being able to access consumers across the globe very, very quickly. And you only, let's say that a couple of years from now, you have 5 billion people online. If you get 2% of that market, it's basically 100 million users. Say that you have some sort of app or some product where you can charge 10 cents a month from each one of these users, then you basically have a $120 million business on an annual basis. So, I think that that's really what I would focus on if I were an entrepreneur. How can I come up with a product, service, application where I can basically go out and get a small slice of an absolutely ginormous market?
Right. So you're based out of Hong Kong.
Yes.
Obviously, that means that you're looking at the Asian market pretty closely.
Yes.
We earlier today we saw Taizo Sun and Ilka from Supercell up on stage talking about their partnership and SoftBank's partnership with Supercell. What are you seeing coming out of Asia? How is Asia evolving and developing and becoming kind of a serious player in internet trends in general?
Yeah. Well, it's Asia. Obviously you cannot generalize because it's a huge market and there are very different sort of trends and markets there. And if I sort of group Asia into a few different buckets, you obviously have China with around 1.3 billion people, 1.1 billion mobile phone users, 600 million people using the internet on a daily basis. You obviously have seen ginormous companies being built in that market, companies like Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, etc. And I think that it's big enough of a market we can really build huge companies. And many of these companies are now starting to look abroad. So Tencent, has been widely rumored, is apparently looking at Snapchat. Alibaba has been looking at different opportunities, and they have been buying companies. So I think that the ambition of Chinese companies is definitely to be more active outside of China. And then, you mentioned SoftBank. I think that it's a fantastic example of a company which is founder-led, obviously led by, I think, one of the most amazing entrepreneurs that we've seen in the last 25 years. He invested, SoftBank's founder, Masayoshi Son, he invested in Alibaba already 12 years ago in 2001. He obviously had set up Yahoo Japan together with Yahoo, 15 years ago.
Sure.
He obviously bought Sprint recently. Now he obviously got involved as a majority owner in Supercell. So I think that you see a number of Asian companies just becoming a lot more active outside of their home markets.
Right. So when we were talking earlier in the week, I kind of reflected on the fact that from my perspective in the US, I'm seeing a lot of headlines where these Asian companies are making big plays in the US, big investments and acquisitions. And that's something that's unusual, at least in my experience or in my lifetime. Is that kind of is there an emerging axis axis or partnership developing between Asia and the U.S. and kind of an affinity there? And if there is, what are the implications of that in Europe or
It's a very good question because I think that there are a few things which for sure make it easier for Chinese companies in particular to think about the US often ahead of Europe. First of all, many of these leading companies, the key executives have either studied in the US, worked in the US, or have just spent a lot of time in the US. So, for example, Robin Lee, Baidu's founder, he worked for a number of years in the Valley before he moved back to China. So I think that there's definitely among key executives sort of a cultural affinity. Also, if you think about the type of markets that you have, China is a huge, relatively homogeneous market, so is the US. So if you want to go somewhere and quickly build a business and find a big market, then US is interesting, and obviously for the American companies, China is interesting. I think that from the perspective of many Asian companies, Europe is seen as a more fragmented place. Fragmented, obviously culture-wise, fragmented language-wise, fragmented regulatory-wise in certain aspects. So it's sort of, I think that the barrier perhaps is a little bit higher to come into Europe. But again, in a market, especially in certain sectors that we've discussed, like mobile, social, etc., the barriers to entry are obviously, coming down quite significantly with respect to that. So I think that we're going to see more activity from Asian companies in Europe as well.
Right. So one thing that interests me about DST's kind of investment thesis is that you invest in founder-led companies.
Yeah.
And certainly, if you look back throughout the years, that makes a lot of sense. Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Masayoshi Son. It seems like the performance of those companies is much greater than those who just hire operators and then go from there. Why? But aside from those anecdotes, why have you chosen to invest exclusively in founder-led companies? What are you seeing there that gives them strength versus operators?
So again, we don't unfortunately sit on on a treasure trove of actual data, and we don't have sort of a huge empirical database that we can base our views on. But I think it goes back to anecdotal evidence, and also from the experience of our founder, of DST's founder. Our founder, Yuri Milner, he basically built one of the biggest internet companies in Russia, mail.ru, over a period of 12 years. And I think that his sort of view that the founder plays a very important influence in successful companies, that's partly the reason. And also, just if you just look at all of the big and successful companies, regardless where they are, whether they're U.S. companies, whether they're Chinese companies or companies elsewhere in technology, almost without exception, the successful companies are led by their founders for extended periods of time. And I think that it's partly because it's the founder that sets the culture in the beginning, and he's sort of the guardian of the culture. And if he sort of leads it in the right way, it's a great motivator. Very often, and we've seen this in some other technology companies that for various reasons don't have the founder at the helm. Very often in large companies, you end up deciding things by committee, by consensus. Whereas I think that in technology, with very fast-moving trends, you need to have a ruthless leader at the top, like a Steve Jobs, like a Larry Ellison, who basically says that, look, this is the trend. I'm going to basically bet the future of my company on this particular trend. And I think that strong leadership is very often required in companies which operate in very fast-moving industries.
Yeah. So it's very relevant at the moment to speak about the Twitter IPO. And you're in a very unique position in that you had a front row seat for both the Twitter IPO and for the Facebook offering. And I think it seems to anybody who's paid attention to the news, those were very different outcomes, at least in the short term. And Twitter seemed to go much more smoothly than the Facebook offering. What was different about Twitter? What did they do right as compared to Facebook? And what kind of lessons can we draw for companies going public in the future?
So obviously both companies are amazing companies. I think that the benefit that Twitter had was that they had seen what happened in the Facebook IPO.
Sure.
But I think that what happened in the Facebook IPO, which is completely separate from the process and banks advising the company, etc., was that they had to undergo a very dramatic shift of basically moving monetization and usage from the desktop to the mobile. And sort of right in the middle of their roadshow, this sort of became apparent. So remember, this was in Q2 2012. So obviously, during the roadshow, they started getting a lot of questions around mobile. I don't think that they necessarily had that clear a plan. And by the company's own admission, by Mark Zuckerberg's own admission, they were just working on it. And I think that what happened was that they came out, the technical factors drove the price very high at the time of the IPO. Then people or investors sort of lost hope that they would be able to get a functioning mobile product and, more importantly, monetize on the mobile. So stock price dropped down to $17. And then when it became clear that Facebook had successfully made this transition from a use case point of view and, again, monetization point of view, and sort of the numbers very clearly showed it in the Q2 report, then the stock price went from $25 to $50.
Right.
So I think that is sort of a strong, obviously amazing execution by the company, followed by a very significant sentiment change among investors.
Yeah.
And I think that if you think about Twitter, it's essentially a mobile product. It's 140 characters from the beginning, the ideal mobile product. So they never had to make that transition.
Right. Is there anything in terms of actually managing, the offering itself, in terms of what the banks can do or what companies can do to, just kind of best practices in terms of, managing expectations going forward, that you would recommend?
So I think that both companies were no doubt, advised by the best possible experts. I think that what is very important for companies that go public in any market is to sort of set the right expectations. And very often it's difficult for technology companies that grow very fast. If you grow your top line by 50, 60, 70, 100%, which is the case in Twitter's case, very often, the market focuses on growth being 100% year on year in one particular quarter. And then if for whatever reason you don't deliver 100%, you deliver 80%,
right,
then the market becomes super disappointed. So it's a very difficult challenge for management to sort of set the right expectations and not at some point disappoint the market, because it's a fast-changing business.
Right. Just going back to kind of the founder-led thesis for a moment, it strikes me that investing is, a mix of art and science. and a lot of it comes down to the personality of the founder running the company.
Yeah.
Are there any commonalities that you've seen among the different CEOs that you've invested in that make them great leaders?
First of all, there's obviously huge passion in the business. You know, they're typically very, very headstrong people, and they have a very clear idea what they want to achieve. And if you think about it, you know, there are, let's take the example of Facebook. You know, 8 years ago, there was probably half a dozen different companies that were trying to do exactly the same thing as Facebook was doing. You had companies like obviously MySpace, Friendster, High Five,
Sure.
VZ in Germany, you know, and obviously a lot of different clones, Orkut in Brazil and India. And obviously Facebook ended up completely winning all of those. And I think that it's basically a combination of a very, very bright and determined founder who obviously had been able to attract a very, very strong team. And then I think that luck also plays a certain role in especially in the early stages of these businesses. You sort of have to have some luck that you sort of make some of the key strategic decisions, correct strategic decisions. And that's what I think that happened in Facebook's case, and what sort of inevitably has to happen in the most successful company's sort of journey to startup.
Sure, great. So, John, I want to thank you very much for joining us today, and unfortunately that's all the time we have, but could we have a big round of applause for John Lindfors, please?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.